Hello guys, welcome to Comment 17, where today we're going to learn how to navigate the inner-city railway network in 2026. In November 2025, Melbourne's Metro Tunnel opened its doors to the public and will be fully incorporated into the Melbourne Suburban Railway network on February 1st, with a restructuring of a few lines' operations in an event called the Big Switch. However, as of this video's release, we are currently in an intermediate period called the Summer Start. Nonetheless, since that will be outdated quite soon, most of this video will be focused on the Big Switch. I will cover the Summer Start arrangement at the end. This is the map of the railway network on February 1st. This map will become outdated later in the year when West Tarneit Station opens, but that is pretty irrelevant to the scope of this video, since it's between Wyndon Vale Station and Tarneit Station on the Geelong and Warrnambool lines. We will specifically cover this region of the network, the section between Footscray and Caulfield, which covers the most operationally complex components of the network. All the lines in the network converge and run around the CBD to transport their passengers to their inner-city destinations. I will refer to this section as the Inner-City network. Do note that this name is unofficial, and I came up with the concept only for the convenience of both the video and you, the viewer. Perhaps the term will catch on, perhaps it won't. The Inner-City network includes sections where the separate line groups converge, namely the sections between Footscray and North Melbourne, and Caulfield and Richmond, and the three sections that pass through the Melbourne CBD, the Flinders Street Viaduct, the City Loop, and the Metro Tunnel. The Flinders Street Viaduct is a viaduct that links Flinders Street Station to Southern Cross Station, the two primary stations on the Victorian network. But for the purposes of this video, I will use the term to refer to the line corridor between North Melbourne and Richmond that passes via those two stations. The City Loop is a set of underground tunnels that go between Richmond Junction and North Melbourne Junction via the northern CBD stations of Parliament, Melbourne Central, and Flagstaff. The different tunnels connect either to Flinders Street or Richmond at the southeast end, and to either Southern Cross or North Melbourne at the northwest end. Finally, the Metro Tunnel is a set of twin underground tunnels that run between Footscray and Hawkesbury and through the CBD along the route of Swanston Street. It has 5 stations: Ardennes, Parkville, State Library, Town Hall, and Anzac, and just opened on the 30th of November last year. State Library is connected directly to Melbourne Central Station, and Town Hall is directly connected to Flinders Street, so they are marked as a single station on the map. By the time the lines join the inner-city network, they have already grouped up. The Belgrave, Lilydale, Alamein, and Glen Waverley lines converged at Burnley, forming the Burnley group of lines. The Mernda and Hurstbridge lines converged at Clifton Hill, forming the Clifton Hill group. The Pakenham and Cranbourne lines form the Dandenong group as far out as Dandenong, and the Werribee and Williamstown lines converge at Newport to form the Cross City group. The Flemington Racecourse and Craigieburn lines also converged at Newmarket, but are very separate in operation and will not be combined. The rest of the suburban lines come into the inner-city network by themselves, while the V-Line lines have mostly converged into a single line coming from the west at Sunshine. But the Gippsland line and the Seymour/Shepparton line are exceptions, which go along the tracks of the Pakenham and Craigieburn lines respectively. Then there are the standard gauge interstate services that go along their own route designed for freight trains. I will now cover how each line or line group runs through the inner-city network, and then how to get around it most efficiently once you're inside. The Dandenong group joins the network at Caulfield, running along the Caulfield corridor until just before South Yarra. It never stops at Armidale, Toorak, or Hawkesbury, despite having dedicated platforms there. It then enters the metro tunnel at its southern portal, running beneath the CBD and stopping all stations along there. It emerges at the northern portal just after South Kensington, stops at Footscray, and then continues on to Sunbury, as the Sunbury line is now part of the Dandenong Group. The Sunbury line completes the same operation in reverse, obviously. The Frankston line also joins at Caulfield, but it stops all stations along the corridor and doesn't enter the tunnel, instead continuing on above ground to South Yarra and then Richmond, where it enters the CBD. It then enters the City Loop, specifically the Caulfield Tunnel, going through the 3 stations before exiting facing towards and going to Southern Cross. And then it goes across the Flinders Street Viaduct to Flinders Street and then Richmond, where it then heads back to Caulfield, stopping all stations. From now on, all suburban lines mentioned will stop all stations in the Inner-City network. The Burnley Group comes in at Richmond and on weekday mornings enters the City Loop's Burnley Tunnel, then goes across the viaduct and back to Richmond. And on weekday afternoons and weekends goes from Richmond to Flinders Street, then across the viaduct to Southern Cross, and then into the loop to come out back at Richmond. I will circle back to this flipping of directions soon, and the next line does it too. The Craigieburn and Upfield lines converge at North Melbourne to form the Northern Group, which runs into the City Group's Northern Tunnel, then comes out at Flinders Street and heads along the viaduct back to North Melbourne on weekday mornings and weekends, while running along the viaduct to Flinders Street, then into the loop and back to North Melbourne on weekday afternoons. The Clifton Hill Group does not reverse direction, and is unique in that it's the only set of lines that enter the CBD without going through any other inner-city network stations. After Jolimont Station, it goes into the City Loop's Clifton Hill Tunnel, then comes out at Southern Cross, and runs along the viaduct to Flinders Street, where it heads back to Jolimont. The Cross City Group comes in at Footscray too, but runs to North Melbourne via South Kensington. It then runs along the viaduct and avoids the City Loop before terminating at Flinders Street, where it currently reverses direction and heads back the other way. Meanwhile, the Sandringham line comes in at South Yarra, then parallels the Frankston line until Richmond, where it heads directly to Flinders Street, where it terminates like the Cross City Group. In fact, the Sandringham line is technically part of the Cross City Group. However, due to works on the Werribee line, combined operation will not begin until later in the year. When it does begin, the Cross City Group will continue on past Flinders Street to South Yarra and Sandringham, and the Sandringham line continuing past Flinders Street to Footscray and Newport, where it will go on to one of many destinations. The Flemington Racecourse line is the final suburban line to cover. When it does run, it begins at Flinders Street or Southern Cross, runs to either Showgrounds or Flemington Racecourse depending on the event, and then returns. It sometimes stops at North Melbourne, but never at Kensington or Newmarket. Some services may even run between the event destination and Flinders Street, skipping Southern Cross. V-Line regional services from Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo, Warrnambool, Ararat, Maryborough, Swan Hill and Echuca are all sharing track just after passing through Sunshine. They stop at Footscray, but skip South Kensington and North Melbourne, where they have no platforms. They then terminate at Southern Cross. Reverse operation occurs for services to those destinations. V-Line regional services from Seymour and Shepparton follow the Craigieburn line and stop at North Melbourne, then head to Southern Cross. I hope the reverse direction is implied at this point, and as I will not mention it again for simplicity's sake. Trains from Gippsland come in at Caulfield, run express to Richmond, then run along the viaduct, stopping at Flinders Street and terminating at Southern Cross. Finally, interstate standard gauge trains, such as V-Line trains from Albury, come in near Footscray, go through some freight yards before merging with the broad gauge lines near North Melbourne and heading to Southern Cross to terminate. Now we've covered every line's operations, I will cover the City Loop shenanigans. You may notice all the lines that use the City Loop also use the viaduct to circle back, or use the loop to circle back after going across the viaduct. The City Loop is intrinsically linked with the viaduct, and the combination of the two is often mistakenly called the City Loop, which is an understandable confusion as the term loop was derived from this looping behaviour. I will refer to this combined loop of track that the lines use as the loop to distinguish it from the City Loop. There are three distinct variants of loop operation, which I have made diagrams for, inspired by those made by the Public Transport Users Association. On weekday mornings, the Frankston line runs anti-clockwise through the loop, as does the Burnley group, while the Northern and Clifton Hill groups run clockwise. On weekday afternoons, the Burnley and Northern groups switch, with the Frankston line and Northern group running anti-clockwise, and the Burnley and Clifton Hill groups running clockwise. Finally, on weekends, only the Frankston line runs anti-clockwise, with the Burnley, Clifton Hill and Northern groups running clockwise. This is because when the City Loop opened, there was a rail yard near Flinders Street that the trains went to off-peak. So trains went into the City Loop first in the morning, dropping off passengers before ending at Flinders Street. Trains then originated from that yard, and thus Flinders Street, heading out to the suburbs via the City Loop in the afternoon. That yard has since closed, and because the practice is deprecated, off-peak usage has risen significantly, and additional operational complications on top of those required to flip direction midday, most notably trains having to cross over each other near Jolimont in anti-clockwise running. Two tunnels now always run in the same direction, the Caulfield Tunnel, which runs anti-clockwise, and the Clifton Hill Tunnel that always runs clockwise. The other two groups continue the outdated practice simply because no reason has arisen for them to adopt a fixed direction. Either way, there are lines running in both directions at all times, which makes going between the loop stations easier. Speaking of, I will now cover how best to navigate the network if your line doesn't take you along the desired route. This will mostly cover arriving in the city, as leaving will just be the same but reversed. The Metro Tunnel has meant that there are lines that take completely different routes through the city, but thankfully there are many interchanges, namely Footscray, Melbourne Central/State Library, Flinders Street/Town Hall, Malvern, and Caulfield. For a simple starter, if you want to access Hawkesburn, Toorak or Armidale stations but are on a Dandenong group train, change at Caulfield or Malvern, or Town Hall/Flinders Street for a Frankston line train, depending on which way you're heading. South Kensington is only accessible through cross-city trains, and if you're coming from Sunbury, it's possibly the fastest way to get to North Melbourne, although Arden Station is quite close to North Melbourne, but it is a bit of a walk. If you're on a cross-city group train and want to access the City Loop, change at Richmond for a Frankston line city-bound train, or a Burnley group city-bound train, but only on weekday mornings. You can change at North Melbourne for a Northern group city-bound train on weekday mornings or weekends, but on weekday afternoons you'll have to change at Southern Cross for a Burnley or Clifton Hill group train. If you're on a Metro Tunnel train and want to access Flagstaff Station, change at State Library for a Frankston line train at Melbourne Central, or a Burnley group train on weekday mornings, or a Northern group train on weekday afternoons. The latter also heads to North Melbourne, the other two will take you to Southern Cross. If you're heading to Parliament, take the opposite groups, namely Clifton Hill all the time, Burnley on weekday arvos and weekends, and Northern on weekday mornings and weekends. The Burnley group also goes to Richmond if you wish to go there. If you want Southern Cross, change for a cross-city Werribee or Williamstown-bound train at Town Hall. Clifton Hill trains also work, as do Burnley on weekday arvos and weekends, and Northern on weekday mornings and weekends. Only Northern group trains go on to North Melbourne, however. To go to Richmond, take a Frankston or cross-city Sandringham-bound train. Burnley trains also go there on weekday mornings. Switching to the Metro Tunnel is much easier. Just get to any of the interchanges and then switch. If your train is heading the wrong way through the loop, it is sometimes possible that switching trains is faster. If you're heading along the viaduct, cross-city trains are good, although they all terminate at Flinders Street, so do be aware of that constraint until the works on the Werribee line complete. If you want to go into the city loop, you're not as lucky, unless you're at Richmond, where Frankston trains always go into the city loop. You could also change at one of the overall loop stations, but that likely erodes time savings. And that's how to navigate the inner-city network in 2026. Or at least, as of February 1st. Operations in January haven't yet adapted to the Metro Tunnel, so final segment, how things are in January when this releases. Operations in the summer start are quite similar to those of past years. However, some services on the Pakenham and Sunbury lines run through the tunnel. To adapt my advice for January, the Burnley, Clifton Hill and Northern groups are unchanged. However, the Dandenong group runs in the Caulfield Tunnel instead of the Frankston line. The Sunbury line is also currently in the Northern group. Finally, the Frankston line is in the Cross City group and the Sandringham line just ends at Flinders Street. To try out the Metro Tunnel itself, note that on weekdays, services only run between Westall and West Footscray and only between 10 AM and 3 PM. On weekends it's better, running between Dandenong and West Footscray, with many trains running to East Pakenham and Sunbury instead, and the times are 10 AM to 7 PM. Note that whichever day you intend to catch it, frequencies through the tunnel will only be every 20 minutes. This will be much higher when the big switch occurs on February 1st. And so that concludes today's video, the first proper video of 2026. I hope you enjoyed this one and look forward to making many more this year. See you next time.